our region's business. Innovation, transformation, momentum, improving our communities and driving technologies that will shape our region for generations. The collaboration that brings vitality, prosperity, and life to living. Stay with us for the coming half hour as we examine in depth our region's business. Now, here's your host, Bill Flanagan.
Today on Our Region's Business, research and development helped to drive our region's transformation. We'll find out how it helped to attract Rand Corporation as well. Plus, turning the Pittsburgh Summit into an opportunity for community service. But first, taking stock of the G20, since the heads of state gathered for the first time in Washington last fall. The Bush administration then brought them together in the midst of a deep and deepening global financial crisis. The group convened again in London in April. And in little more than a week, the Obama administration is bringing them to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It will be the continuation of an important global conversation, one that Marvin Goodfriend has been watching closely. Professor Goodfriend is back with us today. He's an economist with the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome. Good to see you again.
Nice to be here, Bill.
Yeah, you've been kind of guiding us through this whole global crisis and with the G20 coming as well. So why don't we start with kind of how the world's doing since all the economic intervention happened over the last year or so?
Well, the world's doing reasonably well. You know, when we've been in a contraction for, I think, about 19 months now. It's by now the longest recession in the post-World War II period in the United States and in many, many countries around the world, if not all. And this quarter, the third quarter of 2009, is the one where people expect we'll finally have positive GDP growth throughout most of the developing world. There are a few national exceptions. That means technically we will be coming out of the contraction, or the recession will be ending sometime in the next few months, we think.
Okay, so they're coming to Pittsburgh at a time when the world economy may be turning a corner.
Absolutely.
How much has the G20 and all these governments and all the intervention had to do with all of that?
I think the G20 has plays a very important role in this. One of the reasons that this contraction, while it was the worst in many decades, has not turned into the Great Depression is that we have resisted the buy domestic campaigns around the world. Let me elaborate a little bit.
Yeah.
The Great Depression of the 30s turned from a contraction into a collapse of world trade because many countries exhorted their populations to buy domestic. They either told them to do that, encouraged them by law, or put up tariffs against trade to try to keep jobs at home. And of course that was very counterproductive. If everybody does that, then trade collapses. It not only contracts, it collapses. And that's what turned a recession into a decade-long depression. This time we've resisted that. Many of our countries, or most of our countries, have resisted the temptation that ordinarily occurs when their legislatures and their populations push for legislation or tariffs to keep demand at home. But if one country does that, all countries retaliate and trade spins out of control. We've resisted that, and the G20, I think, has played a major role. In fact, I would say the major benefit of the G20 meetings this year has been to resist from the top, the very top, all the way down by domestic campaigns.
Interesting. It's almost like peer pressure working at a global leadership level.
Absolutely. And I can give you a good example of that. The cash for clunkers deal. You know, the United States resisted the temptation to put into that legislation Buy America. And many Americans said, well, that's silly. What if they buy Toyotas with the cash for clunkers? True, it doesn't immediately help Americans. But the alternative would have been to say, Buy America, and we would have found retaliation all around the world, which would have been completely counterproductive in the end and might have caused trade, which has already contracted quite a lot, to collapse. And then we would have been looking at something much more serious.
So what do you think is going to happen with the G20 in Pittsburgh? Are they going to actually do anything here, or is the work done, or are they all just going to pat each other on the back?
I would say, hey, just keep doing what you're doing. Just recommit to not introducing buy domestic legislation so that we can resist the temptation to do that. That would be a huge, huge benefit in exiting this recession and preventing us from collapsing trade even more. I would just say keep doing that. If the G20 did nothing more than to recommit not to introduce buy domestic legislation around the world so that we would not have retaliation around the world, which would be counterproductive. If it did nothing more, it would be worthwhile.
That's and as you say, remarkable. This structure really hasn't existed until very recently. The heads of state never got together at that most senior level. It was always the finance ministers.
Absolutely. There's nothing like pressure from the top down for this key pushback against the inclination, the temptation of the domestic populations to get their governments to put up trade barriers.
Well, and it's tough if you're a democracy, and even if you aren't, I would expect if there's a hue and cry in the streets and people are upset, the political pressure at home is got to be tough, and it takes real leadership to be able to resist that.
Exactly, and I want to point out, you know, we look to be having an end to the recession, which is the contraction in aggregate demand, so to speak, the demand for goods and services. But employment will continue to contract because demand for goods and services actually has to begin to rise at the rate of productivity growth in order to bring people back to work. So we're looking at a period of probably increasing unemployment in the United States and many, many other countries in the world. So we're not out of the woods in terms of pressure to buy domestic yet. So the G20 needs to recommit against that kind of trade tariff, trade protectionism in order to get us through the next year or so. Wow,
fascinating. I remember when you first came down here at the beginning of all of this, we were talking about is there a Great Depression on the way, another one, and that's a bullet that for the moment we've dodged.
Absolutely. I'm like a broken record here, but I have to say it's been dodged in large part because we've blocked this kind of what we call protectionist legislation around the world, which is so tempting.
Pretty remarkable. Only about a minute left. What's it really mean to Pittsburgh to have the world turn up here to continue this conversation?
I think it's absolutely tremendous. And I was thinking about this on the way over here. And Pittsburgh is what you might call a post-industrial city. And there'll be many places around the world which will have to go through what Pittsburgh has gone through. And I think it's nice, it's very, very nice for the world to see how we've done it. Because what's happening is the world's ability to produce goods like cars, hard goods, appliances, is getting so good. The productivity of production of these kinds of things is so good that we will have to shrink employment around the world in goods production over the next 2 generations or so. So Pittsburgh has done what many industrial centers around the world will have to do over the next 2 generations. And it's nice for the world to see how we did it, see our story.
Fascinating. We still make a lot of stuff. We make it with a lot fewer people. Absolutely. We make money. We can then invest it in a lot of new industries and sectors that create jobs.
Absolutely. The future is bright as long as we know how to, we allow ourselves to make the transition from the so-called industrial economy to the service economy, the economy based on education and other sort of intellectual goods rather than hard goods.
Fascinating. Marvin Goodfriend from Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
And next up, Rand Corporation and the World Affairs Council partner also to welcome the G20 and talk about those issues in Pittsburgh. More about that when we return.